What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. From the moment Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky almost unconditionally agreed to a 30 days ceasefire, he hoped Putin would refuse. This was a huge gamble from Zelensky's side, because the ceasefire agreement gave Ukraine not much advantage, unlike Russia. Because recently it was mainly Russian oil refineries that have been attacked the most. One of the main reasons why would Zelensky agree to this ceasefire, and this is something we assumed long time ago on this channel, is to try and expose Putin's true intentions regarding this war in Ukraine. That behind all these speeches that Russia never declined peace, it was always Ukraine who did that, lies nothing else but lies and empty promises. Promises that the world has learned long time ago to never believe in them, since they are coming from Putin's mouth. But apparently, some top-class politicians, including the presidents of entire nations and countries, still think that if Putin promises something, it must be true. So once again, this was high risk but brilliant plan of Zelensky to prove such people once and for all that you can never trust Putin. Because proving it once will be much more impactful rather than trying to convince them with words and photos. So today, let's talk about the world that has been witnessing a high-stakes chess match that is both bizarre and tragic in equal measure. We will talk about international statements, phone calls, rumored deals, and countless reinterpretations that collectively shape the ongoing conflict between Moscow and Kiev. On one side stands Zelensky, convinced that proving Russia's refusal to honor even a minimal pause in hostilities would sway global opinion and secure further support. On the other side, you have obviously Russian President Vladimir Putin, occasionally giving the impression that he might want to negotiate, only to unveil fresh demands or shift his focus towards discrediting Ukraine and the West. And then there is a third part, the United States, represented by the president, whose strategic decisions have ranged from pressing for a total ceasefire.
Ceasefire, Ukraine, ceasefire, just agreed to a little while ago. Now we have...
to flirting with the possibility of meeting some of Russia's conditions, which eventually ended up with Trump slowly realizing that, wait a minute, it's been so long already and literally no progress have been made. Could it be that Putin is playing with me and delays the ceasefire for his own benefits? In case that's true, which, as you can guess, it most likely is, Trump risks being betrayed and humiliated by Putin. And just like him, the least thing Trump wants to happen to him is to be publicly humiliated. Some people thought that once both Russia and Ukraine used the word ceasefire in the same sentence, the war would almost instantaneously come to its end. Or at least some hostilities would turn to a non-existent level. Zelensky himself recently admitted that Kyiv's acceptance of ceasefire was more of a tactical move than an earnest expectation of peace.
Друге, чого він боїться, втратити свою силу. Це також має щодо стабільності суспільства залежить, але і залежить від його років. Він помре скоро, це факт, і все закінчить.
The logic behind it seemed almost theatrical. Say yes, show the world you are all about calm and reason, and then watch Putin make countless excuses at the notion of halting aggression, and so exposing his unwillingness to end the conflict. This approach for a while resonated with Middle Eastern leaders, those who hosted Russian, Ukrainian, American peace talks in Saudi Arabia, who believed in the possibility of an unconditional truce, because apparently they had been convinced by, pay attention, by Russian propaganda, that Ukraine was the one refusing to lay down arms. And so they became the first alleged Putin's allies who started doubting his true intentions. Zelensky's gamble was straightforward. Display goodwill, watch Russia continue hostilities, and so remind those world leaders that no matter how many times Putin claims he's open to pause the fire and fury, his actions reveal completely the opposite. Throughout this phase, rumors and partial truths filled the air, though some representatives of Middle Eastern countries kept insisting that Russia was more than ready to stop the war if only Ukraine would stop ignoring these peace proposals. So Zelensky had to prove he was not the villain. He said, fine, let's do it, and unsurprisingly the shooting did not stop. Those people who thought Putin would grab this chance and immediately sign a peace deal probably were not paying attention to the countless times a potential ceasefire in the past has conveniently already been disintegrated. This logic extended beyond black and white headlines, culminating in Zelensky basically telling the world, here, have it your way, I'm open to oppose in hostilities, that's okay. You will see who really wants to keep the bombs falling. The result was predictable. More shelling on Ukrainian territory, more denial from the Kremlin, and more confusion for external observers trying to figure out who was telling the truth.
There has been no ceasefire, and I think that there will never be one from the Russian Federation because this is a country that has been at war for all its existence.
And so, the agreement intended to showcase peace turned into yet another demonstration that illusions and misdirection have become the bread and butter of this very war. Now you might wonder how Middle Eastern states got tangled in all this. Historically, the Middle East has been a crossroads for global powers, forever balancing between East and West, often serving as brokers or observers in large-scale disputes. When Ukrainian and Russian representatives whispered about possible cessation of hostilities, politicians from these countries claimed to have gathered the intelligence that proved Russia's good faith. But that conclusion was purely based on, you guessed it, Russian propaganda. Something these nations may or may not have recognized at first. Zelensky mentioned in one of his interviews that some leaders from the Middle East had begun pointing fingers at Kiev, asserting that Ukraine, not Russia, was the side refusing to end the war. For anyone following this saga or following common sense at this point, that was very confusing. After all, daily news were still showing Russian forces on Ukrainian territory. So who in their right mind can say that Ukraine here is the aggressor? Just does not make sense. Yet propaganda has a special talent for flipping the script. The Middle East was also confronted with the well-funded machine of Russian state media, which knows obviously how to spin illusions that highlight Ukraine's so-called unwillingness to talk, while minimizing or justifying the Kremlin's aggression. As a result, the conflict was suddenly reframed through the lens of these Middle Eastern countries, whose statements carried enough weight to shift blame around. Zelensky saw the entire scenario and realized he had to perform a diplomatic gamble, publicly accept the possibility of a ceasefire, watch Russia keep up the onslaught, and then say, guys, told you so, to all his skeptics. But unfortunately, in a war of this magnitude with fluid alliances and contradictory statements, this performance did not prompt the miraculous shift Zelensky might have hoped for, at least not yet. We are in the very first stages of peace talks after all. But instead, it underscored how critical and difficult it is to pin down the truth when propaganda has already taken so deep roots. And just like with any other grandiose and brilliant plan that takes time to fully unveil itself, a first step, the one that usually feels insignificant like it is right now, is always required. Amid all the posturing for improving their positions in negotiations, the Black Sea became a focal point. Initially, there was talk of maintaining safe navigation and keeping commercial vessels free from military shenanigans.
The agreements require both countries to refrain from attacking each other's commercial shipping in the Black Sea, which would benefit Russia, as Ukraine has maritime supremacy. Although Ukraine controls Odessa, Russia strikes the city daily. Russia has the Crimean port of Sevastopol.
At least that was the official line from Washington after it announced some progress in separate discussions with Russia and Ukraine. But if you're familiar with the war's maritime theater, you know that the Black Sea has been a stage for significant Ukrainian victories. Like, for example, almost in the very beginning, the sinking of the flagship Moskva, a crucial piece of the Russian Navy. Here is the paradox. As soon as the US proposed halting attacks on commercial and energy targets in the Black Sea area, Russia threw new demands on the table, including the partial lifting of sanctions.
The Kremlin is trying to use the agreement to get some sanctions lifted, including those on the international currency exchange system SWIFT. But that's not in the gift of President Trump.
It does not take a seasoned analyst to see how allowing Russia more financial freedom might embolden its broader military strategy. On the other side, a ceasefire in the Black Sea could theoretically prevent the conflict from escalating into full-blown maritime showdown, especially since it has major implications for grain exports, vital shipping routes, and economic stability for more than just these two countries, Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky, however, insisted that any safe passage deal for ships must be unconditional. Why, some of you might ask? Because once you start adding conditions like revoking sanctions on Russian banks, well, there immediately a question arises, where does it end? Do you give such an economic concession to a power that continues to occupy your territory? French President Emmanuel Macron chipped in too, stating that by attaching new demands, Russia was essentially showing a desire for war. Almost his exact quote. And meanwhile, the original notion of a sweeping 30-day ceasefire that might have given battered regions a desperately needed breather was gradually reduced to an uncertain pause on maritime strikes, overshadowed by the real possibility that those strikes would merely shift to just other front lines. All the diplomatic chaos was topped off by the fact that on the eve of these would-be deals, large-scale drone attacks on Ukrainian territory resumed, and shells landed in multiple regions. In response, Zelensky highlighted that these new attacks, unleashed right after so-called ceasefire negotiations, demonstrate that Russia is unwilling to cease hostilities. Not exactly the sort of behavior you would expect from a government allegedly so eager to bring the war to a close. Experts from the places like the Institute for the Study of War noted that limiting attacks in the Black Sea and on energy infrastructure might actually work against Ukraine's battlefield edge. The argument goes as following. Ukraine's boldest military moves have involved hitting targets that are deeply entrenched in Russian-held areas, whether that's a crucial bridging route or some high-value naval asset. And a partial ceasefire in these regions could, ironically, hamper the very strikes that have eroded Russia's operational advantages. Because if Ukraine has to hold back while Russia still maneuvers behind these newly protected lines, the overall strategic momentum could favor the Kremlin. Zelensky most likely knew all these risks, and he still took the gamble, with his biggest hope being to once again show the newly acquired Putin's friend Donald Trump the real intentions of Putin in regards to continuation of hostilities. Enter now Donald Trump, is the US president at the time of at least recording this video, who openly believed a complete halt to the war was achievable within weeks. And yes, you heard it right. Trump thought the situation might be resolvable by just snapping fingers and orchestrating some phone calls. It started as the conflict being over in 24 hours, then it was a month, and recently they said that in fact, even 100 days was, guys, it was a joke, like, don't take it seriously. And in some early moments, he seemed to get a glimmer of success. Putin hinted at supporting a proposal to pause strikes on Ukrainian energy targets. There was talk of 30-day deals, moratoriums, the possibility of reconnecting certain Russian financial institutions back to the SWIFT system, and then other intricacies and nuances that were meant to promote a rapid decline in combat intensity. But then, like clockwork, the illusions faded. No sooner had Trump and Putin reached a theoretical agreement on refraining from attacks on key Ukrainian infrastructure, then the Russian Defense Ministry announced that Ukrainian drones had allegedly targeted Russian territories. Allegedly. Zelensky swore Ukraine did not strike any Russian facilities, but the Kremlin insisted otherwise, and America found itself forced to publicly re-evaluate the terms of the alleged truce. Meanwhile, Russian demands started, as you would expect it, piling on. Lifting sanctions on certain banks, letting some agriculture companies slip back into the global economic bloodstream, and for each demand left unaddressed, Putin became more unwilling about implementing the truce. As a result, Trump was put in a corner. Either concede to at least some a slice of these demands, or watch the proposed 30-day ceasefire completely crumble. The United States ended up thinking about it, to quote the president, while Zelensky reaffirmed that lifting sanctions would sabotage any incentive for Russia to genuinely withdraw its forces. And so, the big question hung in the air. If you give in to certain demands just to secure a possibility of a ceasefire, how likely you are to see a genuine resolution in the long run? Trump suddenly realized that these promises and praise that Putin gave him just a couple of weeks ago were completely hollow. Putin was simply sweetening the deal for himself and trying to overload Trump with the compliments just to affect his critical thinking. Trump, a self-proclaimed master of deals, got caught in his very own techniques and got influenced by emotions. And sure, the final outcome of this saga is yet to be uncovered, but we are certain Trump started feeling betrayed and humiliated by Putin. Something what Trump wanted to avoid at all costs, but still couldn't. And now he is seeing himself what kind of beast he is fighting in already his personal battle. Well, there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support our work, please go ahead and take a look at our merch at therussiandude.com. We have pretty much everything: hats, t-shirts, hoodies, jackets, pants, mugs, shorts, everything. The link to our store is down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.